Hi, welcome to the Working World. I'm Kara Mendez.
And I'm Jamie Lingham.
Jamie, we just had the virtual couch with Jess Dunderdale, the Director of Sales at AltoVita, and she gave us, I guess, the insight into a greener mobile workforce from the accommodation and corporate housing lens.
Interesting, wasn't it, Karen? I mean, the amount of certifications that there are out at the moment for corporate housing, there's no level of compliance, and it is an emerging space, and it looks like it's going at such a rate of knots. I think Jess had some fantastic insights, and I think everyone's just going to love it. She was great too. Yeah, really engaging.
For sure. And it's really great, especially in this episode, to hear about some of the reporting solutions and the tech solutions that are available in reporting emissions and working towards a greener mobility environment. So yes, one definitely for our audience who are focusing on their sustainability. Enjoy, guys.
Enjoy.
Hi, Jess. Welcome to the Working World. Thanks for joining us. How's everything going?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and joining you today to discuss such an important subject.
Pleasure. Exactly. Yes, very topical. Obviously, the greener mobile workforce, as we're coining it, we're very excited to hear about your lens, AltoVita's lens, in relation to the accommodation industry and part of making up the overall global mobility sector. If it's okay, I might jump straight into the questions around that particular topic. I guess, are you seeing the corporate accommodation sector taking steps to introduce certifications around holding property owners and management agents to a set of, I guess, defined sustainable standards? And what are examples of those that you're seeing?
It's a great question, and one that I love to get on a soapbox to discuss. There are a number of accreditations around sustainability within corporate housing. The problem, I believe, is that there are too many. There are too many, and they're not standardized. They're not standardized and they're not governed. And the problem with that is that then from an individual coming in to try and compare apples for apples, both regionally or globally, is an absolute minefield. And so there are a number of measures, and as well, you can understand that there are going to be commonalities and similarities between those. So we can be looking at whether there are sustainable practices in place, but then as well, if there are the CO2 emissions. There's two different types. There's the quantitative and qualitative measures that we're looking at with regards to a greener accommodation. And so we took a stance for a very long time that we wouldn't certify ourselves because of that. I think the approach then is really to listen to the corporates and understand from their perspective which are the more important certifications. And so we did recently embark on the Ecovadis rating, and that is, I think, our approach to it. But I know that that's not everybody's, and so it is a really challenging place to be in right now if you are wanting to compare what's happening within operators and as well then agents who are aggregating all of those operators together.
Yes, I'm just curious, is this being driven by government as well? Is there legislative changes that have been put in place to ensure that this certification, is, I suppose, in line with a larger program? But you mentioned Ecovadis, and I'm a bit more curious about what differentiates Ecovadis from the rest of the certification, and what does that certification look like?
Yeah, so with regards to governing, it's not there yet. This is the problem. And we do need an industry association to spearhead all of us collectively so that is then governed, and it is then as well equal between everybody. With regards to the Ecovadis, I think that the reason this one has been specifically pulled out from corporates is because it's one that's been identified that they can trust and that they can then use across all of their supply chains. It doesn't just apply to corporate accommodation. It can then apply to all of their service deliveries, and then they can compare like for like in that sense of who of their suppliers are more sustainable and who aren't. That is why I think this one has been so popular now within the corporate space. And that it takes more of a holistic approach and a more overview of all sustainable practices in place. It's not just what's specifically happening within your accommodation, what's specifically happening within that accommodation. Whilst that's important, you also need a more broader approach.
So it's looking at air travel, sea freight. It's got the whole sort of mobility piece in mind.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, so then they could send that to an airline, and they could send it to an accommodation supplier, and then be able to compare and say, oh, actually, our suppliers in airline within the airline space are much more sustainable than they are potentially within the corporate accommodation space. Or, you know, within the corporate accommodation space, we're seeing hotels are being much more proactive in their sustainable initiatives than they are within the alternative accommodation space. So they are able to look at all of that, and then they can say, you know, when we're looking at our green foot, our global, sorry, our carbon footprint, then we know where we're going to be spending more emissions than not. Yeah.
Okay, and so are any of those accreditation programs globally recognised, or are they sector specific or region specific?
There's both. I think this is also one of the reasons that Ecovadis is so popular, is because it does take that global approach. Right. But then there are, of course, a number of accreditations that are more region specific as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which adds another layer of complexity to it again. I'm now starting to see why it's so difficult.
Exactly. So when you do have like a company like AltoVita that we're in 136 countries now, it's like, okay, you know, what do you do? Do you get 136 accreditations? Do you, you know, that's a minefield. And then how's anyone comparing that?
Yeah, I mean, we're just a few minutes in, but it's starting to feel like a pretty big business being this certification, isn't it? I mean, you know, like obviously the influence that it can have through the mobility industry, through corporate travel. It sounds like there'd be a lot of people competing for that space. I just wonder how influenced they can be by, you know, different organisations as well. So I noticed, and I just quickly checked out Ecovadis now, and it's got Accenture listed there, obviously. So I'm curious on how the big corporates are driving this as well.
That's a very good question, and I think that they are driving it. I don't think that they were previously. I think we were all, you know, racing ahead to try and be the most certified, and then just certifying everything and anything that we could.
Yeah.
I think, you know, and there hasn't been so much of an analysis on organizations over the past few years for obvious reasons. All RFPs were put on hold. And so I think now that we come to this year and we're like RFP crazy, there's a need for reviewing those accreditations, those certifications, and being able to compare those more thoroughly. And so it is now being driven, I believe, by corporates and what they require in order to certify. And that has come because they are now analysing the marketplace.
Yeah, and it would be a snowball effect, right? You'd get a big, for example, you've mentioned Accenture, Jamie. It takes one big company like all that, and I guess, you know, others will follow, which I guess, you know, drives the whole movement eventually, and hopefully leads to a consistent compliance. I'm curious though, in relation to the coming back to the regional part of this equation, and you've obviously mentioned that there are different certifications through different regions. Are you seeing, I guess, in the short and long-term accommodation sector, are you seeing some regions doing better than others in that sustainable, greener approach? You know, and obviously comparing EMEA and APAC and the Americas in that analysis.
Yeah, I mean, I think from a country level, there are a number of countries that are really spearheading a sustainable future. That looks like France, Germany, Sweden, the UK. And so I think there is more of a push for this within the EMEA region. The US as well are far ahead in that journey as well. And we are seeing the APAC region isn't necessarily reporting to the same level.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, it is very much an operator level as well, because we could have the most sustainable country in the world, but equally, if there isn't a governed requirement for them to be reporting on sustainable initiatives, then it really is up to an operator level to take those initiatives and implement them within their properties, and then as well then be able to report on those. So from a qualitative perspective, this is where we are, and then there's the quantitative side, which I'm sure we'll get to, because that's a whole other kettle of fish. So I do think that, yes, we do have regions that are more advanced, but within those as well, it is really relying on those operators to be taking those initiatives and implementing them.
You know, to your point, I think that it is such a fragmented area at the moment, and it feels like you said before, we're sort of certifying everything, and that's sort of like, you know, okay, quick, let's put a certification on it, and then I don't know if this country's certification correct. Is there a bare minimum of guidelines on this certification that if I was a mobility practitioner, I say, hey, I want to sign up to, and I see, you know, 10 different organisations who claim to give this certification, is there a minimum that I'd have to expect, do you think?
Not yet.
Okay, right. This is interesting, right?
Yes.
Because you think that there
exactly.
should be an industry minimum that I go, okay, well, I meet this requirement, and I meet, you know, A requirement, B requirement, C requirement, go through all those areas. It just sounds, I mean, obviously as an evolving, I suppose, concept and market, it'd be interesting to see what those things look like.
Yeah, exactly. And this is the problem as well. You know, you can find yourself, because we were in a position that we were so keen not to greenwash, that you're sort of waiting for industry associations to spearhead us, to bring us forward. And it's actually, I believe, having the opposite effect, because we're sort of waiting on this standardization, these minimum requirements. It's not happening. And so we're falling behind the rest of the you know, a supply chain in reporting on these and capturing this data. So, you know, we've had to take it upon ourselves to say, look, we're just going to spearhead forward and, you know, align with our clients, with our corporates, and say, is this in line with what your expectations are? And then push forward that way. And when we get to that point where we do have minimum standards and we do have some standardization, then we can then revisit that and make sure that we're in line with that. But until then, we just have to push forward.
I agree that the industry should, you know, I mean, I think that as an industry body, you should be, you know, representing your members and putting these things forward. What do you think's happened? Like, why haven't these associations actually stepped up to the plate?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think
maybe if you know, carefully in this one, I'm not sure, but you know, I think it's important.
I think when you're looking at when you're looking within the alternative accommodation space, it in itself is so diverse. It's not like hotels where you can probably take one standard hotel, one bedroom, and compare it to the next, and compare it to the next, especially within you know, the same properties. But within one alternative accommodation property, you will have 2 bedrooms, you'll have 1 bedrooms. From one property to the next, you might have double glazing and not in the next, you know, waste management in one, waste not in the next. And so comparing just within, you know, a like for like 1 bedroom within an alternative accommodation, that in itself is already difficult. So then to be able to standardize that and then roll it out across millions of suppliers globally, it's almost like I'm looking at the entire problem and I'm like, this is too big. Whereas, you know, we need to what's the saying? Don't let perfection stand in the way of progression.
Absolutely. Because they're trying to be
we need to be taking steps.
Just get on with it. Yeah, exactly. Do a first draft, and then that's working, it's not working. Let's go draft 2.0, 3.0, etc. I agree. Yeah, taking the first step, right?
Yeah. But surely if you had a long enough runway up to a proposed set of standards and you gave an industry or a diverse range of members within that industry enough time, surely that would be a digestible elephant to eat.
Exactly. And exactly. And that's where we are right now. The corporate is saying, look, we need you to be estimating and reporting on CO2 emissions, not just what's happening, not just whether they've got green energy and an EV charging station. We need to know what are those CO2 emissions, because we have targets. They have targets to be net zero by 2030, and you're either on that journey with them or you're not. So it is really very prominent and very important that we are all pushing forwards.
Speaking of pushing forwards, what are you seeing around energy efficient technologies and practices? Are they being implemented within the corporate accommodation space in order to reduce that energy consumption?
Yeah, they definitely are. There are, we're trying to support our partners, our hospitality partners, in that sense, to be taking those minor steps. Like we say, let's not worry right now if you haven't got the resources to put in solar panels. This is okay, this is later down the line, but let's make steps now. And those steps can be minor. They can be using energy efficient light bulbs, waste management in the properties, removing single use plastic, get rid of all of that, bring in a water jug. These are minor steps that can already be taken. And then, of course, we are looking at the larger, have we got eco-friendly cleaning products? Have you got that smart water management? Have you got those solar panels? Have you got those EV charging stations, like I said? And, from our perspective, what we can do is track what those practices are in place and then report on the behavior. So this is also one side that's really important. Are we seeing an uptake where you do have sustainable practices within an accommodation? Is that being chosen over one that's not? So that we can see this trend month over month as well, hopefully with that greater adoption of a sustainable property.
On the governance piece, which you mentioned earlier, if it's all self-governed, that obviously makes it quite difficult, right? Because organisations or certification providers will say, yes, definitely that's there. How do organisations check to see, I suppose, how ethical these providers are as well? Is there some?
Yep.
I mean, do you see this coming on the horizon? Do you see some sort of top level governance organisation? I mean, maybe there's a whole new business in there, Jess. You could do a certified of certifiers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
You come here, that's maybe AltoVita can step in and say, well, it's like fact checkers, certified checkers, and you basically create this product. I don't know. That's maybe a good one to speak to Vivi about.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, it's definitely the diversify the offering. That's for sure.
Absolutely.
That's a good one.
Yeah, enhance it.
The bubble has to burst, and that has to be reined in. And so I do think that is on the horizon. From a perspective of being able to confirm these practices that are happening, it does depend. If you're I'm coming from a place of an agency where we have, we've got 7 million accommodations globally now. So but measuring that is very different to being an operator and then, managing your set of your portfolio of accommodations. But I think from our perspective, we are using technology in order to support that human approach to reviewing. So from our perspective, we have the technology to support where we can see geotagged and time-stamped videos, pictures, checklists of the evidence of what's actually of the practices that are taking place within the accommodations. This is very important. When it comes to the emissions, again, this is a little bit different. So, we are enlisting the support of a third party who this is their bread and butter, is measuring CO2 emissions, and then using those as well with certain metrics and measurements of these practices that are taking in place in order to currently estimate CO2 emissions. So that's where we are right now with the practices that are taking place. I lost my train of thought there.
It's all right. No, it's okay. I mean, look, we're going through the governance and what's in the future as far as like making sure that there's an overarching framework, I suppose, that can check these things. And it sounds like, I mean, I can't imagine. So you get 7 million different properties that will send you all the compliant things, so you'll have that on file?
Yeah, correct. Exactly. And this is where we do need technology to support that. And then when, you know, where we see higher volumes, you then do that human check as well on top of. But in order to roll that out as to scale it to that level, you do need technology, I believe, to support that approach. But yeah, so moving into the future, yes, there has to be a place where we do have, you know, one or a small handful, if you're going to be looking regionally, of accreditations that align with one another, that then corporates can look at and say, that's the one I need. And I know that one aligns with that one, and that one aligns with that one. So from a global perspective, you know, I'm set from my accreditation perspective, and we have to be at a place where we can measure what practices are taking place within properties at scale. Because right now what you have is you have a handful of properties that are not a handful, but there's a lesser number of properties that are adopting and reporting on these initiatives on a global scale, and you don't necessarily want those to be singled out as more sustainable, because they may not be. It's just that they're the ones reporting on it. So it does need to be rolled out on a global level moving into the future. And then of course moving into there has to be the measurement of CO2 emissions. Right now that's estimates, but within the next few years that has to be actual CO2 emissions. And again, we cannot afford for that to be, the measurement of those CO2 emissions to be greatly different between suppliers, because if not, again, it's just going to be greenwashing, and everyone's going to be guessing what's more sustainable.
Those accommodation providers or owners of, I'm thinking kind of the one or two property portfolios who let their properties out for corporate housing, do you think there's going to be a space or a point in time in which regulation will, I guess, come down from a particular body, which I guess puts them out of the game, so to speak, which requires them, in order to get, you know, a certain level of certification or regulation in order to meet these standards, which then if they don't, they almost don't get a license to participate in the game. Yeah, because I mean, whilst, you know, we just spoke a little bit about the reporting solutions available obviously through AltoVita, and then some corporates would also have their own reporting tools as well. There has to be a point at which, you know, if a particular accommodation provider or property isn't reporting on those outputs, that they either don't get chosen anymore, or by a body they're opted out as being a viable option.
And then that's a huge challenge as well, because then we're not being inclusive, and that's we don't want that to happen either. So as much as possible, we need to be supporting all of the operators globally to be taking initiatives, not just to report to corporates, not just because they're asking for it, but because this is the way our world should be going, to ensure that we have a future for our children and our children's children and our children's children. So this is something that we should be supporting anyway. From what we have decided, what we, you know, internally at AltoVita, is that there also has to be a point where we can't necessarily be relying on 7 million properties to give us their sustainable practices. There has to come a point as well where these CO2 emissions step in, and we, without having that input of their data, we need to be able to measure what those CO2 emissions are on properties. And that comes from complex property management systems that can capture a lot of this data, and then we can convert that into that CO2 emissions. So I think that as well will ensure that suppliers aren't being excluded from a pool, because there will be CO2 emissions listed. And it's a hard fact, it's a hard pill to swallow, that if you're not taking initiatives and therefore you're not more sustainable, then you're not going to be chosen. And like I said, it doesn't have to be really complex and costly initiatives, practices, and these accreditations should not be charging. If they're going to then be governed and regulated, then they shouldn't be charged, I believe, to complete that, because if not, you are going to come to that situation whereby people can't afford, suppliers can't afford more niche suppliers, aren't going to be able to afford that, and it's going to be complicated.
Yep. It's interesting to me, Jess, and I'll probably be a bit controversial, but it's sort of okay. I'm happy with it. It's like we've got a sort of collision of two ideals going on here, because obviously the carbon emission conversation meets the inclusive conversation. And I think that, unfortunately, like anything, if people aren't moving into that, environmentally friendly space and having, I don't know, what do you have, 15 clothes dryers kicking out emissions, flat out, you're probably not going to make it in the program. So I think it's a really interesting point you make. I think that, we sort of have to not step on a few toes, but I think people have to move with the times and move what's going on. Yeah. So I think that there's going to be a balancing act. Now, just a question. I know that you've been to a lot of thought leadership events, and you've spoken, around the world and on different things. What do you think is in store for the future? Like what's not on our screen at the moment, and is there anything you see that's coming that we'll need to be aware of, or corporates will need to be aware of in relation to mobility, particularly global mobility?
With regards to accommodation? Yeah,
exactly. Is there any things that are coming along that you sort of see that people are talking about? I don't know what that would be. Like, I have to go to an Airbnb and share a room as opposed to having my own Airbnb. I don't know. I'm just throwing a couple of things here. If there's been any sort of crazy ideas thrown out.
You're right. Yeah, I think we're going to see, to your point, this like conflict happening because, and this is something to be aware of, cost containment is high on everyone's agenda.
Yeah.
Of course, the environment that we're all living through right now, that's been met with these sustainable targets.
Yeah.
How can these all be rolled out? How are we choosing, is sustainable property going to be more expensive than one that isn't? How does that align with cost containment? How do as well then we ensure that we're being inclusive of our entire supply chain? So I think that there needs to be caution and awareness that these are conflicting objectives from a corporate perspective. And so they need to go into any review of the marketplace with very clear objectives as to what's higher on their agenda between all of these initiatives. Because longer term, that's not going to necessarily be all aligned, and that's going to be a problem.
I guess for an organisation that is trying to get clarity on their objectives, is there and I know we've talked about at the start, there's a number of different certifications, but I guess the one that your AltoVita are aligning themselves with, are you seeing, or what are you seeing are the long-term sustainable goals of that certification for the corporate housing sector?
Yeah, so there's also two areas to that certification, to sustainability practices and certifications. You have agencies like AltoVita. So whilst we can ensure we are certified and our objective is to be net zero by 2030 to align as well with our clients, is then all the operators as well underneath and making sure that, that everyone's following in suit. The objective in looking into the future is for us to be accurately measuring CO2 emissions so that by 2030 we can be accurately ensuring that we are all net zero. That's the main objective within sustainability within accommodation, looking forward into the future.
So for our listeners and audience who are sort of new to this game, I know obviously, the bigger players are well into it, but for those who are new, where would they go to start to build these policies? Where would they start to look for these, type of, I suppose, cues to ensure that they're doing the right thing? Because, obviously the big organisations have the staff and they have the resources to be able to do these types of things and the money to invest and all that sort of stuff. But I'm sure there's that next layer down, and they're definitely the one under that who'll be looking and saying, well, I like the concept, but I don't know where to go from here.
Yeah, I think I'm going to be honest. I've had a number of corporates reach out to me this year, which never happened previously, to ask, what should I be including in my RFP? What's important? And I think that having somebody within this industry, within this space, who really is abreast of what's happening across the board on a global scale, who can guide on what they should be looking for, it is key, is probably, in my opinion, the most beneficial way, is the quickest way and the easiest way as well of aligning with what's important for you. If not, that being said, there are associations. There's like ASAP, the Association of Service Apartment Providers, who are as well, who are doing an awful lot for our industry, trying to get this governed, who as well can support with what individuals should be looking for that to form part of their program. So there are people out there who are happy, and like myself, love to talk about sustainability, and so can support to ensure that that's being met within house.
So we just you.
Yeah.
Send them all your way, Jess.
This is where my number comes up along
exactly.
the bottom.
It just flashes on the screen.
Yeah. 1-800 call Jess. Yeah.
Perfect.
I feel sorry for your inbox. And I guess, for some of our viewers, of course, who are mainly based in the APAC region as well, I imagine that they would, be best speaking to their local industry group to spearhead some of those certification conversations, because I'm sure if there's multiple certifications happening within the EMEA region, then I'm sure that's also happening across other regions as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
Maybe it's a watch this space, and we revisit this with you, Jess, in 12 months and see where we're at. That would be great. Yeah,
the space is moving so quickly. Within 12 months, we are contractually agreeing to be estimating CO2 emissions. So within 12 months, the space is going to be very different already.
I feel like it's going to be the rationalisation seems to be the first thing for me. Like in my mind, I just feel like that there's so many different organisations moving at so many different speeds. I feel like we need to ring fence it and get some very clear, uniform guidelines on a global scale. Yeah.
I mean, you're looking at, I always like to give the example, there's one supplier within the space that has 6 accreditations, of which 1 is self-certified.
Yeah, there you go.
Look at that, it's like,
blood bank.
Which one's the good one? If you have so many, which one's a good one? So it's...
Well, the fact that they've only they're self-certifying 1, does that mean that it couldn't get certified with anyone else that said, we're just going to do it on our own, that's fine.
I'm sustainable now.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, Jess, thank you so much for your insights around the corporate housing and accommodation sector. It is a part of the wider, greener mobile workforce solution that we're talking about, and we want to thank you today for your time and your thought leadership. So thank you so much, and have a lovely day.
Yeah,
Jess, it sounds like you have a lot of work ahead of you. It sounds like this is only going to get bigger. I think it's been really insightful. I appreciate your time, and we look forward to catch up with you in 12 months so you can give us the update.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jess. Okay, see you later. Bye.
See you then. Bye.